think has been described publicly as well, is it was more like a debate, two intelligent people engaged in discussion about policy issues. When we got to COVID, I think it was much harder. It was evident in his exchanges with the Scottish Government, with the First Minister, and I think with the other First Ministers, because we would all be on the same call, that he didn't want to be on those calls. He wasn't necessarily well briefed on those calls, and he wasn't listening to the points we were making on those calls. And so I think engagement with him came to be seen as slightly pointless during this period.
And I think it's going as early as it was March 2020. I think in one of your notes you described Cobra as a shambles.
Yes.
Was that the view that you had from very early on, from March 2020, that the Prime Minister wasn't really wanting to engage with the Scottish Government?
Yes.
And how did that then affect, from the Scottish Government, its working relationship with the UK Government and the working relationship between the First Minister and the Prime Minister?
I think in relation to the Scottish Government and the UK Government in broader terms, there was fairly constant and fairly good communication and cooperation. I think particularly in health, this is evident, and at times, not always, but at times in the economic space. And I think officials at all levels sort of had discussions that were quite good. But the discussions between the First Minister and the Prime Minister and other First Ministers, I mean, it was never bilateral. There were always the First Minister of Wales and the First Minister and Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland on these calls as well. They didn't get us anywhere. So we started with a very clear approach that we should all try to work together, and moving into lockdown was all done in a coordinated fashion. But when you got to what I think the First Minister wanted to be substantive discussions about what direction to go in, a thrashing out of different proposals and different ideas, that wasn't what we got. We got a Prime Minister who, it certainly felt at the end of the video screen or at the end of the line, was reading a script and would summarise the contributions of the three First Ministers and the Deputy First Minister from Northern Ireland in ways which largely ignored the points that they had made.
And how early on in the pandemic response did you come to that realisation?
It was difficult. I mean, it was more effective at the beginning, sort of March, although it was obvious that they were not, hugely keen on having us there and being in the room. It was actually quite effective with Dominic Raab for the period in which the Prime Minister was in hospital. And it's when the Prime Minister sort of re-engages in the discussions that it is evident, as you're talking about, the lifting of restrictions, for example, changes in messaging, different approaches between Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and the UK, that he is not informed and doesn't want to be there. And
I think there seems to be kind of a very clear divergence in messaging from around the 10th of May 2020. You recall that's where the UK government messaging moved to stay alert. The Scottish government remained at stay at home. Was that the point, if we're trying to identify in terms of timeline, where there was now clear divergence in the approach between the two governments? Or did it occur earlier than that?
I think that's the point where it becomes clear that there is going to be a difference in approach between the two governments, that the approach to lifting restrictions in England is going to be different to the approach to lifting restrictions in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland. And that I think the sort of philosophy or ideology behind the lifting of restrictions was coming from a different place. So that is, I think, the point at which it becomes clear that we're going to go in slightly different directions, and we have to try and work out how to go in different directions within the UK as a whole.
If the First Minister of Scotland thought that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom was a clown or utterly incompetent, that doesn't really create any sort of functioning relationship between the two leaders of the respective governments, does it?
I mean, this is later than that point that you raised earlier about May, by which point I can't think of conversations in this period that were happening directly with the Prime Minister. They were happening with Michael Gove.
Can we now turn to page 21? And we've now moved on to the 1st of November 2020. And I wanted to look at messages that begin at 6:29 p.m. And here you say, and I quote, "My reason for setting a timeline for them to answer us on furlough is purely political, especially as we expect the answer to be no. It looks awful for them, and creating that kind of pressure could possibly result in a yes, though agree we shouldn't bank on it. Think I want a good old-fashioned rammy, so can think about something other than sick people?" And Nicola Sturgeon replies, "Yeah, I get it, and it might be worth doing. I've sent a rough formulation of what I might say tomorrow. I could for it in there." So if we pause there, can you help us? What do you mean by good old-fashioned rammy with the UK government?
I think this is an expression of frustration that we were not able to manage the pandemic at this point in time in the way that we wanted. And I mean, a good old-fashioned rammy is language I would rarely use, actually, but, is that we needed to have the argument in public. There were a lot of things in COVID where we didn't have the argument in public. There were a lot of things in COVID where the UK government did something and we just let it go, or they didn't do something and we just let it go. I particularly felt this issue of furlough at a time when we wanted to apply restrictions and furlough was ending was materially important to the handling of the pandemic. It was a hindrance to our ability to handle the pandemic. And I can't deny, I was angry about that position because it really did block our ability to do what we wanted to do. So I think the message reflects that frustration, perhaps bubbling over a little bit.
Yes, I think earlier on we'd looked at your notebook and the entry from the Gold Commands from the 28th of September, and I think you'd said you'd taken issue with how I'd characterise it as a public spat. By this stage, on the 1st of November, you are looking for a public spat with the UK government. Is that fair to say?
I am definitely looking, I'm clearly looking to air the issue strongly and publicly. And as I say, in the vague hope that it might get as an answer, might get as a yes.
We're looking for a public spat.
I'm looking for a public spat for a purpose. Public spat could often deliver results. If the public pressure on the UK government was there, it had been shown in the past that they would sometimes change their mind if they felt that pressure. And what I want them to do is change their mind.
So the discussion is whether the furlough scheme should be available to Scotland, because at this stage, England had just entered into the second national lockdown in England. And you're setting what is effectively a political trap for the UK government. If it refuses to extend the furlough scheme to Scotland, it looks awful for them and strengthens the argument for independence because you need to go alone. Or if it extends the furlough scheme to Scotland, there is additional funding available to Scotland. Therefore, for the Scottish Government, a good old-fashioned rammy with the UK Government is a win-win situation. Is that not the essence of the point that you're making here, that you're looking for this from purely political perspectives?
I would dispute that there's any issue of independence in this. So I am keen, very keen, that we get a yes in this situation and that we are able to enact the restrictions at the time, public health restrictions at the timing the Scottish Government deems appropriate, with the financial support that should come with that. If there is a no, what looks awful for them is that they are not enabling us to take public health steps at the time that we want. If the wider world wants to read constitutional implications into that, that is for them, but I was not making them.
And it was around this time that I think the furlough scheme was extended to Scotland in November. Is that correct?
It ultimately was. There was significant pressure, public pressure, placed on the UK government. Ultimately, it did it because it did it for England. And this was the issue, was that finance decisions that related to mitigating public health measures were not coordinated with the decisions each of the four nations might make on those public health measures. They were only triggered, if you like, when England took a decision, and Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland all faced significant difficulties during this period for that reason.
Can we turn to now page 23 in these WhatsApp messages? And here, just by way of context, what's being discussed here is efforts to have a four nations approach to restrictions over Christmas in 2020. And you'll see messages that from you that begin at 9:04 p.m. And you say, Gov want to talk tomorrow, it's just come in, have said to, and there's a name redacted, to hold off going back till the morning and suggest waiting for the proposal before agreeing. Nicola Sturgeon replies, I've just seen the email. I'm happy to do call subject to proposal, but I wonder if we should make clear in advance we won't agree anything without Cabinet approval and get Wales to sign up to that. You reply saying, yep, Cabinet Tuesday is a good marker. Tuesday or Wednesday might not be bad days for us to announce either. I'm increasingly leaning to just one other household after seeing the poll, but I'm also a Grinch about Christmas. And then Nicola Sturgeon replies, I am too. But on this, I reluctantly think there's merit in the UK-wide position. Let's see the proposal. So Nicola Sturgeon's reply to you on the 20th of November seems to be emphasising that she's reluctantly seeing the merit in the UK-wide position. Does this not suggest that by this stage, the default position for the Scottish Government was to be different from the UK Government?
I think it was the default position for each of the four governments to take the decisions that suited their geographical and pandemic-related circumstances. It was not that we would be different to the UK or different to Wales. It was that in taking the right decisions for the people we were responsible to, the Scottish people, in fact, they were not necessarily the same decisions that the UK was taking.
But Nicola Sturgeon doesn't appear to be very enthusiastic about Four Nations' approach by this time, does she? Where she's almost reluctantly having to sign up to it.
I think there was a reluctance in general around Christmas positioning. We were essentially bounced by the UK government into a position about Christmas. Telling people they can't have it when the UK government have said you can was a very difficult situation to be put in. There is a reluctance, and you can see this higher up, subject to the proposal. We're reading in the public domain that people will be getting some sort of relief from COVID over Christmas. We have not seen a proposal that we are about to go onto a phone call and be asked to agree to. So this again goes to some of that what was to us a chaotic and shambolic sort of approach. So it's very hard to sign up to something and to enthusiastically embrace something that you have had no input into.
Were your advisors, whether it be scientific, clinical or medical advisors, advising you about the benefits of having a cohesive approach across the UK around the restrictions over Christmas 2020?
Yes, to an extent, in part because of travel. And it was travel that led us largely to look for a cohesive approach. What I recall of the advice from advisors around Christmas was, we don't think this is a good idea. Make it as minimal as you can if you have to do it at all.
I now want to move on in the period to, you left your role as Chief of Staff in March 2021. And you say that after a short break, you came into the role of Strategic Political and Policy Advisor to the First Minister in August 2021. I think you say in your statement that you didn't have any involvement in the pandemic response beyond this date, except for COP26, which took place in Glasgow, I think in November 2021. Is that correct?
That's correct.
On the 7th of September 2021, Nicola Sturgeon announced that work would start again on the second independence referendum campaign. Does this announcement, or did this announcement coincide with your change of position from Chief of Staff to becoming the Chief Political Advisor and Strategic?
It broadly coincides in date terms, but it doesn't coincide in reason. I did not take a post. My post was not involved in any move on independence. I attended the odd phone call, but it was far from the principal purpose of my job.
What was the principal purpose of your job after August 2021?
Initially, it was the COP26 summit and to lead the sort of Scottish Government's policy work in preparation for that. It was then to focus, and this was something I had felt as Chief of Staff we were missing, was to step back from the front line, from the media, from the Parliament, from the day-to-day, and to focus on some of the long-term commitments that we had as a government and that we'd made in the 2021 election around moving to renewable energy, around reaching net zero, around tackling child poverty. So I worked on things like the new economic strategy, the draft energy strategy, the resource spending review. I attended some of the Constitution Secretary's independence meetings, but I did very little work on it. It was not my purpose.
So, just so I understand, in your role as strategic, political and policy advisor to the First Minister, and this is around the same time that there's this movement towards a second independence referendum, your position is that you didn't actually do very much work on independence.
I didn't. There was a delegated special advisor whose role was the Constitution. He covered Brexit primarily and the development of the work on independence. I think it might be useful to say I had not been in government over that summer, and I think that there's been a reference on Material provided me, a BBC article sort of headlining this independence issue on that date in September that you remembered or cited, which is, again, the publication of a programme for government. I had had no involvement in the writing of that programme for government. Unusually, it was the first one in probably 10 years that I hadn't been part of. And it has maybe a page's worth of references to independence in a 180-odd page document. It was a programme for government that set out, as we had in the election, a number of key policy objectives within government, and I had moved to lead on those policy objectives because I had a reflection, which the First Minister had shared, that you needed a special advisor who could work across portfolios with her confidence to try and inject some energy into them.
Did the move towards pushing for a second independence referendum, did that reflect a change of priority for Nicola Sturgeon away from the pandemic response and to the second independence referendum campaign in middle of 2021?
At that time, no, for her. I mean, I wasn't there day to day, but my recollection of her in that time is that she remained incredibly focused on the COVID pandemic. You can think about more than one thing at a time when you're First Minister, but she devoted vast amounts of time to the COVID pandemic during this period still.
Was she devoting vast amounts of time to the independence strategy around this time?
It was largely led by the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution.
I wanted to move on to another area, and this is around the public health messaging during the pandemic. You say in your first statement, and I don't intend to bring this up, that you have considerable experience in public communications. Is it fair to say that until at least March 2021, you played an important role in the Scottish Government's communication strategy in relation to the pandemic?
Yes.
And this included leading on, for instance, the preparations for the daily media briefings. Is that correct?
I would share that responsibility with the head of the COVID briefing unit, but yes.
And in fact, we've seen some WhatsApp messages that you were actually one of the people that would decide, for instance, which advisor would appear on any given day. Does that accord with your recollection?
Decide is public about the actions we were asking them to take. There was a lot of focus on explaining to people why we were asking them to do certain things, because that would boost the compliance, helping people understand the situation they were in and that we were in, and encouraging the behaviours that we needed people to undertake in order to mitigate the spread.